Great senator and Republican candidate for President of the United States, Senator Ted Cruz. Well, Jim and Bernadette, let me say thank you and wow! Let me start by saying Tom Brady was framed.
Right! Yes! Sting operation.
Now, I'm not willing to pander on much, but on that, Tom Brady was framed.
You got it.
And I will say this, I have it on good authority that Hillary Clinton did it. Why do you think she deleted her email? Let me say, Heidi and I are thrilled to be with y'all. She and I, both of us, have lived here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We both went to graduate school here in the Commonwealth, and we are thrilled to be with so many patriots here in Massachusetts. You know, Jim, listening to your story about the Alamo, it reminded me of a former senator from Texas, a hero of mine, Senator Phil Gramm.
Yes.
Who was one of the original Reagan Democrats. He was an old blue dog Democrat. And when Reagan was president, Phil Gramm helped corral Democratic votes for Reagan's tax cut. And Phil has described to me how he would sit with Democratic congressmen and he'd say, look, this is the right thing to do. And he'd tell that same story, Jim. He'd say, this is when William Barrett Travis drew a line in the sand. Every man there had to decide, do you step across the line or do you stay cowardly where you were to begin? And Phil said a number of those Democratic congressmen responded to him. They said, Phil, everyone who stepped across that line died. And Phil's response is, yes, that's true. And you know what? Everyone who didn't step across that line, they died too. And nobody remembers their names. This is something here in New England y'all understand. Our country is in crisis. What's happening right now, this is not a typical election. What we're doing doesn't make any sense. In 6 years, we've seen the national debt go from $10 trillion to $18 trillion. We're bankrupting our kids and grandkids. We've seen the federal government go from an institution that protects the Bill of Rights and our constitutional rights to a government that violates the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. And under the Obama-Clinton foreign policy, we've seen America recede from the world. And the world right now is literally on fire. But let me tell you, if you remember nothing that I say tonight, well, then you probably hit the bar a little too hard. But if you remember just one thing that I say here today, let it be this, that I'm powerfully, profoundly, deeply optimistic. As bad as things are, people are waking up. They are waking up in Massachusetts. They are waking up in New Hampshire. They are waking up all across this great nation. Let me tell you, we are, who would have predicted 500 people in Andover, Massachusetts? The central issue in this next election in 2016 is going to be reigniting the promise of America. Getting back to that fundamental ideal that our kids would have a better life than we did and their kids would have a better life than they did. How do we do that? 3 simple things. Number 1, we bring back jobs and growth and opportunity. Look, y'all understand cause and effect. Every time we pursue out-of-control spending and taxes and regulation, the result is misery and stagnation and malaise. And every time we pursue tax reform and regulatory reform, the result has been incredible economic growth. We saw that in the 1920s. We saw that in the 1960s. We saw that in the 1980s. And by the way, I will point out in the 1960s, one of the most powerful, eloquent defenders of tax cuts was John F. Kennedy. JFK said, "Some men see things as they are and ask why. I see things that never were and ask why not." JFK would be a Republican today. There is no room for John F. Kennedys in the modern Democratic Party. How do we bring back jobs and growth? Number 1, tax reform. We spend about $500 billion a year on tax compliance. The best tax reform, we should adopt a simple, flat tax. So that every American can fill out his or her taxes on a postcard. And when we do that, we should abolish the IRS.
Send them to the border! Have them at the border!
There are about 90,000 employees at the IRS. We should padlock that building. Take all 90,000 and put them on our southern border. Now, to our friends, the Democratic trackers who've joined us, that was somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But think about it for a second. Imagine you'd traveled thousands of miles in the blazing sun. You're swimming the Rio Grande. The first thing you see is 90,000 IRS agents. You turn around and go home too. The second key to economic growth is regulatory reform. Regulators from Washington, the alphabet soup, have descended on small businesses, strangling and crushing small businesses and making it impossible to create jobs. And I was out in West Texas, and I asked a simple question. What's the difference between regulators and locusts? Well, the thing is, you can't use pesticide on the regulator. And this old Texas farmer leaned back. He said, "Want to bet?" And the simplest and most important regulatory reform. We need to repeal every word of Obamacare. We need health care reform that makes health insurance personal, portable, and affordable, and keeps government from getting between you and your doctor. The second key to reigniting the promise of America is we need to defend our constitutional rights. All of them. The First Amendment, our free speech, our religious liberty, especially our religious liberty. You know, last year following the Hobby Lobby decision, Senate Democrats introduced a constitutional amendment to gut the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act. When it passed 20 years ago, it passed the Senate 97-3 with bipartisan support. I gave a speech on the Senate floor saying, how could you be acting against Christian companies? How could you be acting against the Little Sisters of the Poor, a Catholic charity that's taken vows of poverty that the Obama administration is litigating against? Trying to force the Little Sisters of the Poor to pay for abortion-inducing drugs for others. Now let me suggest a real simple rule of thumb. If you're litigating against nuns, you've probably done something wrong. But I gave a speech on the Senate floor in defense of religious liberty. Next to me was a giant poster of JFK. My dad turned on C-SPAN, scared the living daylights out of me. He said, my goodness, my son's gone native. But JFK said, I will not stand with someone who will not stand with religious liberty. I said, where are the Democrats? Is there even one Democrat who will stand for civil liberties? No. When it came time to a vote, do you know how many Democrats voted to uphold our religious liberties?
None. Zero. Zero, yeah.
We need to defend the Second Amendment, the right to keep and bear arms. Vice President Joe Biden.
It's a joke. Uncle Joe, idiot.
Bernadette, you know the nice thing? You don't need a punchline. I promise you it works. Next time you're at a party, just walk up to somebody, say Vice President Joe Biden, and just close your mouth. I promise you, they will crack up laughing. But Biden says, if anyone attacks your home, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun. Fire both barrels in the air. Now that is very, very good advice. If it so happens you're being attacked by a flock of geese. We need to defend the Fourth and Fifth Amendments, our rights to privacy. How many of y'all have your cell phones? Let me ask you, please leave your cell phones on. I want to make sure President Obama hears every word we say tonight. We need to defend the 10th Amendment.
Yeah, that's a big one.
Or as President Obama calls it, the what? The fundamental protection that says the powers not given to the federal government are reserved to the states and to the people. That means their core areas the federal government has no business sticking its nose, and chief among them is education, and we need to repeal every word of Common Core. Education is too important for it to be governed by unelected bureaucrats in Washington. It needs to be at the state level, or even better, at the local level, where parents have direct influence and control. And the third key to reigniting the promise of America is we need to restore America's leadership in the world. For 6 years, we have seen the Obama-Clinton foreign policy of leading from behind. Our friends and allies no longer trust us, and our enemies don't fear us. Instead of a president who boycotts Prime Minister Netanyahu, imagine America standing unapologetically with the nation of Israel. Imagine a commander-in-chief who stands up and says, "We will defeat radical Islamic terrorism." And we will call it by its name. Imagine a president who says, and under no circumstances will the nation of Iran, led by theocratic zealots who chant death to America, under no circumstances will they be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. I suspect many of y'all are thinking, all of this makes sense. I agree with this. But can it happen? How do we make it happen? Are we too far gone? Can we turn our country around?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Well, let me tell you, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. I think where we are today is very, very much like the late 1970s. I think the parallels between Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter are uncanny. Same failed economic policy, same misery, stagnation, and malaise, same feckless and naive foreign policy. In fact, the exact same countries, Russia and Iran, openly laughing at and mocking the President of the United States. You know, the one person in America thrilled with the job Barack Obama's doing is Jimmy Carter. Now, why does that analogy give me so much hope and optimism? Because we know how that story ended. As a result, millions of Americans across this country began rising up. A grassroots movement that became the Reagan Revolution. And it didn't come from Washington. Washington despised Ronald Reagan. By the way, if you see a candidate who Washington embraces, run and hide.
And the media.
It came from the American people. It swept up like a tsunami. It turned this country around from stagnation to booming prosperity, from our hostages in Iran to their being released the day Reagan was sworn into office. I am optimistic. I am hopeful because of each of you. What happened in 1980 is happening all over again. All across this country, millions of men and women, people have never been involved in politics before. Let me ask you, how many people here have not been actively involved in politics before? Look around at the hands. This is important and this is powerful. This was the Reagan Revolution. People that were going to church, that were going to work, that were raising their kids, that looked up and said, "What on earth is happening to our country?" The same thing is happening again. 58 years ago, my father fled Cuba. He had been in prison. He had been tortured in Cuba. They beat him almost to death as a teenager. When he came to America, he was 18. He couldn't speak English. He had $100 sewn into his underwear. which actually I don't advise carrying money in your underwear. His first job was washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. He worked 7 days a week. He paid his way through school. He went on to get a job to start a small business. Today, he's a pastor based out of Dallas. My dad's been my hero my whole life. But you know what I find most incredible about his story? How commonplace it is. Every single person here, we got a story just like that in our backgrounds. Some of us, it's us. Others, it's our parents. Others, it's our great-great-great-grandparents. But what ties Americans together is we are all the children of those who risked everything for freedom. That's the fundamental DNA of what it means to be an American, to value liberty and opportunity above all else. And I'll tell you what my dad said to me over and over again when I was a kid. He said, when we faced oppression in Cuba, I had a place to flee to. If we lose our freedom here, where do we go? That's why the men and women are gathered here, because we will not go quietly into the night. So I'm here to ask for your support for us to stand together to unify a grassroots movement to take power out of Washington and back to we the people, and get back to liberty and back to the